All right, hi guys. Let's review the pathways, the ascending and the descending pathways in the spinal cord as we have learned together in our lecture. So we're going to review them in order to summarize them, and we'll try to do it with the board since the computer is failing to work. So what we have is, we're going to start first with the posterior funiculus medial lemniscus pathway. Posterior funiculus medial lemniscus pathway. So to draw it, then we will start with a typical spinal cord segment. Here is the ventral and the dorsal horns. And we agreed that this is the gray matter, of course, and then surrounded by the white matter. Here is your fissure, and in the back, here is your sulcus. This is posterior, this is anterior. Sometimes we refer to them as dorsal and ventral. So we agreed that a sensory nerve will come, or a sensory neuron is coming in, and the cell body, remember this is just, you can't really call it a dendrite or an axon, but this is where the sensory information will be carried nevertheless. And the cell body itself, we agreed that it's right here outside the spinal cord, and what we agreed to be your dorsal root ganglia. This will be the dorsal root. As it enters to the spinal cord, we agreed together that it's not going to relay. It's not going to the dorsal horn. It's not going to the second order neuron. This is the primary order neuron. And going from here, it's going to just ascend up in this posterior segment here, which we call the posterior funiculus. So the neuron not terminating, just continuing up in the posterior funiculus. And you may remember in the class, we also agreed that the posterior funiculus has medial column and lateral column. The medial column will be the gracile column, or what we call the gracile fasciculus, and the lateral column is what we call the cuneate fasciculus. So for the sake of illustration, I just put that track going up outside them, but it's really one of those two. It's either the gracile or the cuneate. The gracile is the lower limb, and the cuneate we agreed to be the upper part of your body. So as it continues to ascend up, then it will be greeted by the medulla oblongata, right? And the medulla oblongata, if we draw it, then it has this funky structure here. It looks like this. Okay. So over here, you're going to have a nucleus. We have two nuclei. One of them is for the cuneate, and the other one for the gracile. So the cuneate and the gracile nuclei will be in your medulla oblongata, right? And so that's the place where you will relay the message. Let me change the color here so it will be obvious for you that we are actually changing the neuron. So this is the first synapse that we'll take care of. And then we have a neuron here. This is your second order neuron. And this neuron, the information will be relayed from number 1 here to number 2, right, through the synapse. Where? In the gracile and the cuneate nucleus. So as this one relays the message, then the axons from this neurons are going to cross to the other side. So the decussation here happens at the level of the medulla oblongata, right? And then it will continue going up. As it's going up, it's going to go to the pons and the midbrain. And in the midbrain, so I'm going to ignore the pons at the midbrain. Let's try to draw it together. So we have here your tectum, and here is your cerebral peduncles. So we agreed that here in the tegmentum, we're going to have an area here called the medial lemniscus, right? And over here we have the red nucleus, and if you remember here we have the substantia nigra. That anterior part is the tectum, and here we have your central aqueduct and the periaqueductal gray matter. We agreed to those structures. What's most important to us is this part here, which is your medial lemniscus. As these fibers are ascending, they're going to merge together to get into the medial lemniscus. Sounds good? As it's going up from the midbrain, that's why, by the way, we called it posterior funiculus medial lemniscus pathway. As it's going up, it's going to go through the thalamus. And let me choose another color here. And so the thalamus will be north of this, superior to it. And here is the thalamus. And in the thalamus, you're going to make your final relay. So here you have your third order neuron, which is going to take the information into your cerebral cortex. So here is the cerebral cortex, or the sensory area of your cerebral cortex. So we have, in this case, we have 3 neurons. The primary neuron will, the cell body of the primary neuron is residing in the posterior horn, or in the posterior ganglia, or the dorsal ganglia, or the dorsal root ganglia. And then the tracks are going to continue going up without crossing, without relaying. When it relays with the next neuron in the medulla oblongata, whether it's the cuneate or the gracile fasciculus, and by the way, this specific pathway, instead of calling it the posterior funiculus medial lemniscus, sometimes we refer to as the cuneate and the gracile pathway. Okay? Then it will cross at the medulla oblongata, or what we call decussates. This is the process of decussation, when the neurons cross to the other side. 100% of the neurons will cross to the other side. They will go through the pons, will start entering the medial lemniscus in the pons, and continue through the medial lemniscus in the midbrain. And as they ascend up, this is the thalamus. As they ascend up in the thalamus, they will relay the message here in the thalamus to the third order neuron, which will take the information finally to your cerebral cortex. Sounds good so far? This is your first pathway, which is the posterior funiculus medial lemniscus pathway. Let's talk about the second pathway, which will be your anterior lateral pathway. Anterior lateral pathway, generally, it's associated with pain, temperature, crude sensation, not vibration, not really the precise sensation. We're going to have 2 of them. One of them runs on the anterior side, and the other one runs on the lateral side. That's why we call it anterior lateral pathway. Another name for the second pathway, we call it the spinothalamic tract. And you will see why we call it the spinothalamic tract in just a little bit. So let's again draw a typical spinal cord segment. Here we go. And here is your fissure. Here's your sulcus. We're good. So here's the sensory neuron. And this time now it's carrying also sensory information, but it's not the fine touch and it's not the precise touch. No, it's pain and temperature. So pain and temperature, here is the cell body again. As it enters to the dorsal horn, then it's going to relay. So it's different than this one. This one ascended straight up to the medulla oblongata, then it relayed. Over here, it's not the case. We're going to relay the message in the dorsal horn. So over here. So this is the second neuron now, or the second order neuron. And now since this is pain and temperature, it's going to cross to the other side, and it's going to climb on the lateral side, or the lateral funiculus here, and it's going to climb up the spinal cord. Sounds good? So the difference between this guy and this guy, as you can see, over here, I did not cross and I did not relay. Over here, I relayed and I crossed to the other side. Sounds good? Then this is going to ascend up. It's going through the medulla oblongata, and it's going to go through the pons. Nothing is happening in those areas. And it's going to continue to ascend in the midbrain, also using the medial lemniscus, by the way. And so we will also go through the midbrain. And finally, we get into the thalamus. So at the thalamus, so as it's ascending to the thalamus, here's your thalamus. It's going to give you your next relay. And so what's different here is that the first relay here happened in the dorsal horn. Over here, the first relay happened in the medulla oblongata. Over here, the crossing happened in the medulla oblongata, and right here in the anterior lateral pathway, the crossing happened at the same level as the spinal cord is entering, or the sensory neuron is entering to the spinal cord segment. Okay? So as it relays the message at this level in your thalamus, so this is the thalamus now. This guy is going to take the message to your cerebral cortex as well. So here we go. That's it. Again, the difference between this guy and that guy is the site of the first relay and the site of the crossing. And also, of course, the area where it's ascending. So this is in the lateral part, and this here was on the posterior funiculus instead. Sounds good so far? Okay. So if this is the pain and the temperature, what about the crude sensation? What about the crude sensation? So the crude sensation is also going to follow the same pathway. I'm just going to draw it on the other side, but you pretty much understand that it's what happens on the right also happens on the left. But if I draw it here, it will be too crowded. I can try to fit it in. So here we go. Again, it's a sensory neuron. So we agree that the cell body is sitting here, right, in the dorsal root ganglia. And then it will continue, and bam, it relays. Where does it relay? In the dorsal horn as well, just like this one. And the only difference here is that this one, after it relays, instead of crossing all the way to the lateral, right, side of your spinal cord, it's going to cross, yes, but it's going to end up over here. So the decussation also happened, but it didn't cross all the way to the lateral side. It just stayed here on the anterior aspect. And then it will continue going up, just like this one went up. And also in the thalamus it will go up, and in the thalamus you will have the final relay. So everything else goes the same, except for just the position where the cables are going up. Over here, we had the cables on the lateral, so this will be the lateral spinothalamic tract. This one is the anterior spinothalamic tract. This one carries temperature and pain. The lateral carries temperature and pain, and the anterior carries the crude sensation. Are we good? So this is the second track we talked about, which is the anterolateral pathway, or another name for it is the spinothalamic tract. And please remember there is an anterior portion and posterior portion of the spinothalamic tract. We're good? The third one, the exact tract is of less interest to us, but what was of interest in the lecture, as we discussed, is, once again, let's go here into a typical spinal cord segment, and here is your white matter. Okay, and so what's interesting here is that the neurons that cross, right? So the neurons that are coming, again, they're sensory neurons, and so as they do this, right? So one will cross to the other side, and the other one is going to stay here, whether it's anterior or on this lateral area, it's not important. One of them is going to be more anterior to the other. So whether it's here or there, it's not really the issue. What's important to us is that a single neuron is giving cables that are going on both sides of your spinal cord. And that one here, which crossed to the other side, it's going to turn around and it's going to be going to the same side of your cerebellum. So whatever has crossed, it's going to cross back to the cerebellum. So why is that important to us? Well, it's important because you will realize that the neuron here in the cerebellum is going to receive the same message, whether it's going up this track or going up that track. Why is that important for us? Well, we discussed somehow the injuries that can happen in the spinal cord. So let's say here you severed the left side of your spinal cord. That means this part here got damaged. So what will you have is this track is going to be interrupted. Those tracks are going to be interrupted, and this track is going to be interrupted. Let's see here, what does that mean? If I interrupt this track, then I am disrupting the fine and the accurate sensation on the ipsilateral side, on the same side, because the neurons are coming here. They did not cross yet. If I cut these guys, it still is on the left side of your spinal cord. If I cut this, then I'm interrupting the pain and the crude sensation and the temperature from the opposite side of the body below the site of the injury. And if I would cut this side, then it's not going to affect the sense of position and the information going to the cerebellum. The other thing that's interesting about the the spinocerebellar tract, which is this guy, is that it only has 2 neurons. If you count the neurons here, we have 1, 2, and then 3. Same thing, 1, 2, and 3. Whereas this guy will only have 1 and 2, and then you are at the cerebellum. Also, this is the only one that doesn't go through the medial lemniscus, because the medial lemniscus is all the way up north, and this is exiting at the level of the medulla oblongata and the pons, so it's way before it gets to the midbrain, it has already exited. So there are certain differences here. This one doesn't go to the thalamus because the cerebellum is, of course, inferior to the thalamus, so that's another distinguishing characteristic that we need to keep in mind. So these were our 3 ascending tracks: the posterior funiculus medial lemniscus pathway, your anterior lateral pathway, or the spinothalamic tract, and the spinocerebellar tract. Sounds good? Okay, so I'm going to make another lecture like that, or a review like that, for the descending pathways, and we're really going to be focusing on the pyramidal tract, the direct. As you remember in the lecture, we did not really discuss the exact tracks and the exact pathways of your indirect paths. Sounds good? All right, so join me for the next lecture where we will, or the next review, which will be about your descending tracks or the motor tracks instead. Sounds good? All right.